Hey guys, it's Kiera, and in this episode we'll be talking about pricing, and it's a very important step in the process of actually dealing with your client, because you need to make sure that you're not working for free, and you need to make sure that you quote a reasonable number that you can work within. Because if you quote $200, you need to make sure that you can do all the work that's required within that $200 without feeling rushed, overwhelmed, or even feeling that you need to take on 2 orders at once just because you can't pay the bills. So you need to establish what this base price is and then scale it up depending on what your creative process is, who the clients you're working with is, if you need another Adobe subscription or better hardware or more tools or other living expenses that you also have to take into consideration. All of that has to actually create a quote for the client that he can either say yes, no, or even negotiate you down for. You need to make sure that you have this actual figure in front of you and you have a good representation of what you can do within the limits of that figure. Because if you do get paid $400, you can't expect to work 2 months on this client. It's just not very negotiable. There's not enough time for everything, and you'll be missing out on other clients, other work, and you won't even get paid for it. You'll be working less than minimum wage. So again, very important and very crucial step of the process. So the figure that I would be pricing for a client and the figure that you'd be pricing for a client are 2 completely different numbers. Because we both have very completely different requirements with what we need in order to actually complete the project. So it depends on the creative process, the actual step-by-steps of how we work, and even with the clients who we're working for. So in my example, I need 2 hours for the emailing of the client for extra information, an hour for the creative brief, 2 hours just to research the logo on Pinterest, their company, their competition, at least 3 hours just to sketch this logo out, refine, look back, A/B test, 3 hours to vector the proposals because there's going to be a few iterations. I might want to go back and forth, might want to go back and vector almost every single logo I sketched. I'm not sure, it might be a complicated logo. It's hard to predict at this point. Proof it, create the presentation, iterate through variations, and even saving the logo formats, because saving every logo in PNG, black and white, SVG, PSDs, AI, throwing it all in Dropbox, saving it, proofing it, sending it to the client, seeing if he can even open the files, that's also part of the process. You're charging for that entire process. You're not just charging to think of the logo, you're charging for this entire block of time. And you need to make sure that you have this base price almost, the minimum amount that you need in order to comfortably achieve this. On top of that, it also depends on the client you're working with. Because if this logo is just going to be for a cupcake shop, they might not see a lot of value from it. Sure, they might have a better logo and their customers might appreciate it more just because they can connect with a business better. But on a broader scale, if you're working for a bank, for example, or an investment firm, then they might see like millions of dollars in extra value than this cupcake business could. Because they might be able to use it for advertising. They might be able to grow their visual identity better. Their letterheads might be even more professional. They might gain more clients, exposure. And in general, they're going to get a lot more from your work than the cupcake shop could. And charging $400 for both the bank and the cupcake shop just doesn't make sense. They're going to require different types of work, different types of attention, research, value, and at the end of the day, you got to see how they're going to be using your work. Because if they're going to be using your work to profit in the millions of dollars, it doesn't make sense to undercharge yourself to work for them, right? You have to price fairly and you have to price reasonably. And that's 2 very important factors to take into consideration. You also have to take into consideration that you're not going to own the work anymore, right? Because if you create a t-shirt design, for example, you could just sell the t-shirt design on your own time or for a client on a, let's say, limited license for only 6 months and you get 2% of the sales. Great. And then you can reuse that design for later. But in other scenarios, if you're doing a logo design, you're expected to give up all your rights to the logo design. Sure, you might put it in your design portfolio, but you can't resell it. You can't claim it as your own and start up your own startup with the logo. You have to give up all those rights to the client. They own the entire logo, the entire letterheads, the entire visual identity. And if you're not owning the work that you created anymore, you have to take into consideration if that means anything to you and if you want to charge extra just because you're giving up all those rights. And that's usually why logo designs are actually so expensive. Because usually when people come across and they see that the logo design, had a cost around of $4,000 to it, they gasp like, oh, that's so much money for just such a small symbol. But they don't take into account that the artist doesn't own any of the work anymore. And just for that, there's a pretty large fee attached to it. And then when you're actually doing all this work and you set up this actual payment, so $400 for this entire creative process, you don't have to limit it to the entire project, but to almost like a scope of what you're going to do in that $400. So in my personal example, I could sketch an unlimited amount until we find a very interesting visual and creative direction, then create 2 proposals for that and present it through a few mock-ups. That would be my scope for what I would do for $400. But in your case, for example, you might do 4 proposals, right? But you limit it to that certain amount. It would be very naive to actually say that you're going to develop the visual identity for as long as it takes, because you never know how long it can take. So setting up these payment retainers, you can actually say that you're defining the scope, the amount of work that you're willing to do in this amount of time. And then afterwards, if they want more revisions or if they want more letterheads or more business cards for their individual employees, you can charge an hourly rate. So even then, you're pricing something that you can actually predict how long you're going to work for, because there's nothing worse than actually being rushed through a project. So let's actually talk about the different businesses and the different rates that could apply for these types of scenarios. So the first one being a charity. You can charge for that. They are a charity. They're not for profit and they're not going to have exactly a lot of funds to pay you with. But you can expect to work for them for free. But if you're just starting out, they're actually a really great way to test out your process and even time how long it takes. Because it is an actual client. They're just not going to be able to pay you with it. But you can test how long it's going to take you to sketch out the logo, present it, even email the client. You can take all that into consideration before you move up onto the next step, onto small startups, companies, and even established corporations. So the next step is small startups. And for small startups, I usually just have the basic rate, the amount of money that I would need in order to go from my process from step 1 to step, whatever the final send deliverables step is. And that's just the very basic rate. They're not going to be profiting that much. There might be having some local advertisement. It's usually just limited to one owner. It's going to be on a blog, and it's not going to scale that much. On the other hand, you have a company that's going to be for profit, and they're going to require a style guide. They're going to have multiple employees. They're going to need supplemental material. And they're going to actually be a profitable business, so they're going to be generating money. And if they're generating money and they're purchasing designs from you, they're going to be generating even more money if they use those designs perfectly and for how they're used, and even effectively. Because if they can effectively put your designs to work and you create really well developed with depth designs, then you're going to see that they're going to actually invest in your work and see a nice return of investment. So for usually on that, I would charge my basic rate plus 50%. And that doesn't include if they need style sheets or business cards. That would be all expenses that would add up on top. And then for established corporations with, multiple firms, multiple heads of offices, you're going to want to charge your basic rate plus 200% or 400%. It's really an eye of judgment from there. Because if you see that they had $65 million in profit in that year, you'd be crazy to charge your basic rate of $400. Especially when they're going to have a global reach and they have multiple companies and investors and employees. If they can pay an employee a monthly rate, then they can surely pay you that weekly rate that it takes you to actually develop the logos. Because as opposed to an employee, they don't have to pay for you to stay there in their offices for your lunches, for your healthcare, and anything else that might apply. You're almost like a contractor, and you're only going to be there for, let's say, a week. And you're not even going to be there, you're just going to be working for them for, let's say, a week or a month. So, again, feel very confident to charge a bit more just because, again, you're providing more value. But you still might have that fear that you're pricing too much. And that's very common with designers who are just starting out. You might see a business, you might feel sorry for them, or even the actual client might spark the conversation that their budget might not be enough. Could you do something about it? And that's very common in our industry. Often designers and clients are trying to, mostly clients to designers, they're trying to throw them off their game almost and see how much they can shake them up for to drop their prices. Because they're usually investing a large amount of money, and it's possible to drop a designer a couple $100s if you make them feel sorry for the business or that they can't afford it, etc., etc. I've seen plenty of those emails go around even asking for free work. It's very common in our industry. So some of the tools you can actually research how much these businesses are making. And you can actually start off with Shopify University. and it's just a basic forum where people are talking about their different businesses of e-commerce. But on this actual Shopify University forum, they often actually talk about their figures, and it actually blew my mind, my misconception of how much these businesses were actually making. Because I often went on these t-shirt shops, these bikini shops, these poster shops, and just assumed they made like a couple $100s a day. I mean, what could be the demand for these t-shirt designs that sometimes might not even look visually appealing to me? But after seeing that their figures are $60K a month in revenue, kind of blew my mind that I was charging, let's say, a small startup fee for these small e-commerce companies that were actually generating a lot of revenue. So it's a good way to actually get over the fear of pricing too much, because you can often see that a lot of these companies are doing quite well for themselves, and when they're investing in you, they're even looking to get a better return of investment. I mean, if they can develop an even better logo for themselves, a better visual identity, then their profits are going to double or even triple, depending on how they use them. There's also FameBit advertising, and you can actually see how much YouTubers or even content producers are being paid. And even working in ad agencies, that kind of also blew my mind, because I always thought these YouTubers would be paid in almost just an advertising revenue through their videos. But just for a brand mention or a product mention, they'd be paid up to $50,000 for a 30-second snippet. And that's a crazy amount. And then all of these YouTubers would often come to designers from other firms and asking for designs of, $100 logos or a $40 design for their YouTube channel, even though they're generating $40,000, right? And you shouldn't fear pricing, a higher value like $1,000 for an entire visual identity design for some of these larger YouTubers and content creators, just because they are generating a lot of money, but they're not sharing these figures publicly, which is why you might be actually scared of pricing a bit higher. There's also forums like Reddit Entrepreneur, and you can actually read about also some promotions that are going on in the industry of e-commerce and advertising, and Reddit Graphic Design. You can always ask and even see what kind of rates are currently floating around in the industry for day rates, or even like how much it costs to develop a logo. But again, on top of all that, you need to consider if you're going to be using deadlines as part of your process for actually pricing the client, proposals, requirements for style guides, and even costs for the actual mock-up purchases. Because if you go to Graphic River or Creative Market and you want to buy some new mock-ups to show off the client's logo on, let's say, a car wrap or even on a glass window, that all costs money, and very great mock-ups cost up to $300. And that has to be part of your process, because if you know that you're going to be convincing this client of your work and really showing off how this logo you made them, let's say for this established corporation, is going to do them justice, then having these mock-ups is going to be vital in order to present the work. But in order to buy the mock-ups, you need that actual revenue. So charge more so you can afford to bring the company more value. It's pretty simple. So hopefully you get over your fear of pricing, and hopefully you know how long your actual creative process is going to take, just so you're comfortable within those means, and you can actually start pursuing clients with confidence, because you know that you can provide them with the maximum amount of value, and that you're not going to be rushed through your own process just to deliver a logo that you might not even be happy with. So I'll see you in the next lesson.